Parker Schnabel was 3 days from hitting his 8,000-ounce season target, roughly $15 million in gold at current prices, when his excavator bucket struck something that wasn't bedrock. What he pulled from the permafrost at Dominion Creek forced him to shut down operations entirely, costing his crew an estimated $200,000 in lost production. Inside a rusted metal box buried since 1946 were letters that revealed a secret his grandfather, John Schnabel, took to his grave. Here's what was inside. We both knew, Parker, it was going to have to come down sometime. That's life. And why Parker walked away from the richest pay layer he'd found in 5 years. The discovery, November 23, 2024. Dominion Creek, Yukon Territory. The thermometer read -28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed metal burned skin on contact, and diesel fuel turned to gel if equipment sat idle too long. Parker's operation had been running non-stop for 16 hours. His D10 dozer was pushing pay dirt toward the wash plant at a rate of 180 yards per hour while the excavator worked the cut face. They were close to something big, just 847 ounces short of the 8,000-ounce season goal, with maybe 4 days of viable mining weather left before the cold would force a complete shutdown. Ground-penetrating radar had identified a pay layer below their current depth that looked promising, potentially 40 ounces per 100 yards. The kind of concentration that could make an entire season profitable in a matter of days. But getting to it meant going deeper than Parker had ever mined at this claim. It meant pushing equipment designed for temperate conditions into territory where hydraulic seals could fail without warning and engine blocks could crack from thermal stress. Brennan Rua, Parker's foreman, had been vocal about the risks. Every hour they ran in these temperatures was another hour closer to catastrophic failure. Parker understood the math. He also understood that pay layers like this didn't come around often. You found them or you didn't. And when you found them, you worked them until they were gone. The excavator was chewing through a layer of ice-cemented gravel material that hadn't seen daylight in thousands of years. When the bucket hit something solid, the operator felt the impact through his controls. Not the scraping resistance of bedrock, but something distinct, something that shifted when the bucket pressed against it. Parker saw the anomaly immediately, an angular shape among the rounded stones. Metal catching the work lights as the bucket rotated toward the sluice box. He shouted for the excavator to stop, his voice cutting through the diesel noise and the rattle of the wash plant. He walked to the bucket, boots crunching on frozen ground. Nestled in the gravel was a steel box, roughly 12 inches square and 8 inches deep. Rust covered most of the surface, but the basic structure was intact. The permafrost had preserved it like a time capsule, protecting it from the decay that would have destroyed anything left on the surface. Parker lifted it carefully. The weight suggested contents inside, papers maybe, or small objects. He carried it past the wash plant, past the crew members who'd stopped to watch, and into the heated workshop where the temperature hovered around 50 F. His crew gathered at the doorway as he set the box on the workbench and began cleaning the surface. A wire brush removed the worst of the sediment and ice crystals, revealing details underneath, hand-welded corners, the kind of careful metal work that took time and skill, and scratched into the lid with a sharp tool, initials and a date that made Parker stop moving entirely. JS 1946.js. John Schnabel. His grandfather, the secret in the box. Parker stared at the letters for a long moment. The workshop was quiet except for the hum of the space heater and the distant rumble of idling equipment outside. His crew was watching, waiting for an explanation he didn't have. The problem was simple. The initials didn't make sense. John Schnabel hadn't come to the Yukon until the 1970s. Parker knew his family history. He had grown up hearing stories about how John left Oregon as a successful businessman, got interested in gold mining, and eventually built Big Nugget Mine into one of the most productive operations in the Klondike. That timeline was clear, documented, consistent across every family conversation Parker had ever had. There was number 1946 chapter. There was no young John Schnabel in the Yukon 30 years before the history Parker knew, but the initials were unmistakable. Parker had seen his grandfather's handwriting on hundreds of documents over the years. The way John formed his letters was distinctive, and the JS on this box matched perfectly. He worked the corroded latch, feeling it resist and then give way with a grinding protest. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept moisture out for nearly 8 decades, were papers, dozens of letters, yellowed but legible, all written in handwriting Parker recognized immediately. Photographs, their images still clear despite their age. A small leather journal with entries dated from April through November 1946. And at the bottom, resting on a layer of cloth, a pocket watch. Quality craftsmanship. Silver case engraved on the back with initials that weren't John's, EMR. Parker pulled out the first letter. The paper was brittle at the edges, threatening to crack if handled roughly. The ink had faded to brown but remained readable. He scanned the opening line, "Dear Eleanor, I know you'll never read this, but I'm writing anyway because I don't know how else to survive what happened. I came to the Yukon to forget you, to disappear into the kind of hard country that doesn't allow time for grief. But the silence up here just makes your absence louder." Parker looked up. His crew was still watching from the doorway. For a moment, the workshop felt very small and very quiet. "Get back to the wash plant," he said. His voice came out rough, not quite steady. "We're losing daylight." Brennan hesitated. "Boss, you need anything?" Parker shook his head. "Just keep production running. I need some time with this." The crew dispersed and Parker heard the equipment resume its rhythm outside, the excavator swinging, the wash plant rattling, the steady work of turning frozen ground into gold. He stayed in the workshop, reading John Schnabel's hidden past. The story in those letters assembled itself piece by piece over the next several hours. John Schnabel had been engaged in 1945 to a woman named Eleanor Marie Richardson. EMR, the initials on the pocket watch. The early letters referenced plans they had made together, a business John wanted to start, a house with a front porch, the children they'd raise. John had served in the Pacific during World War II, had survived combat that killed thousands of men his age, and had come home believing he'd earned the future they'd planned. In spring of 1946, Eleanor died. The journal entries from April were difficult to read, not because of the handwriting, but because of what they contained. Fragmented sentences. The same facts repeated across multiple pages. She had been sick. It happened fast. There was nothing anyone could do. One entry dated April 19 consisted of a single line, "Buried her today. I don't know how to exist in a world where she doesn't." The entries that followed documented a decision. John couldn't stay in Oregon. Every street, every building, every familiar face reminded him of what he'd lost. He'd heard about the Yukon from other veterans, stories of a frontier so remote and physically demanding that it left no room for anything except survival, a place where a man could work himself to exhaustion and maybe eventually find a reason to keep going. In May of 1946, John loaded basic supplies into a truck and drove north, crossed into Canada, followed rough roads until he reached Dawson City, the old gold rush town at the confluence of the Yukon and Klondike rivers. He was 24 years old, and by his own account, he'd stopped caring whether he lived or died. The journal covered 7 months. John worked placer claims for other miners, learning the trade from the ground up. He wrote about the physical exhaustion of moving gravel by hand, about equipment that broke down constantly, about grizzly bears that wandered through camps and mosquitoes thick enough to drive a man insane. He wrote about isolation, weeks passing without meaningful human contact, entire days where his own voice was the only sound besides the creek and the wind, and he wrote about Eleanor every few pages, sometimes every page, not moving on, not forgetting, but learning to carry the weight differently. The entries from June and July were dark, references to not seeing the point, to wondering why he was still here. By August, something shifted. The entries grew longer, more observational. John wrote about finding satisfaction in hard work, about the honesty of mining, where effort translated directly to results. By October, he'd made a decision. "I've decided to leave the Yukon," he wrote on October 28, "not because I couldn't make it here. I know now that I could stay forever if I wanted to. Part of me does want that. The safety of isolation, a place where nothing can hurt me again. But I'm not running anymore. I'm carrying Eleanor with me. Always will. But I'm ready to live again. And I can't do that if I stay here hiding from the world." The final entry was dated November 2, 1946. John wrote about burying the box, the letters, the photographs, the journal, everything except Eleanor's pocket watch, which he planned to keep. He was leaving evidence of his worst year in the ground because he needed to stop carrying it physically. Needed to trust that the healing he'd found was real enough to survive contact with the world he'd fled. Parker set down the journal and sat in the quiet workshop, processing what he'd read. Outside, the wash plant was still running. He could hear the diesel engines cycling, the rattle of the sluice box, the occasional shout from crew members coordinating equipment movements, normal sounds. The sounds of a gold mining operation pushing toward a season goal. He did the math. If John had stayed in the Yukon in 1946, if he'd chosen permanent isolation over the risk of returning to the world, there would have been no eventual marriage to Nancy, Parker's grandmother. No children. No grandchildren. The entire Schnabel family line that Parker belonged to existed because a broken young man decided to leave this ground and try again. That night, Parker called his mother. The conversation was difficult. He was asking about history the family rarely discussed, but she confirmed what the letters suggested. Yes, John had been engaged before Nancy. Yes, the woman had died young. When John eventually married Nancy in the early 1950s, he'd been honest about his past. She'd accepted it, built a life with a man who'd been shaped by loss. The cabin on Hunker Creek. The next morning, Parker made a decision that his crew didn't understand. They were gathered at the wash plant for the daily briefing when Parker told Brennan to shut down operations. "We're 3 days from target," Brennan said. "You want to stop now? We've got maybe 72 hours of workable weather left. I need to find something." "Fine." "What, Parker?" "We're sitting on the best pay layer we've hit all season. You said yourself it could run 40 ounces per 100 yards. I know what I said. So we're walking away from that to find what exactly?" Parker looked at the operation spread out before him. The wash plant. The excavator. The cut where they'd found the box. The ground that had kept his grandfather's secret for 78 years. "There's a cabin mentioned in the journal on Hunker Creek. My grandfather spent a winter there in 1946. I want to see if it's still standing." Brennan stared at him. The rest of the crew exchanged glances but said nothing. In 15 years of mining, Parker Schnabel had never voluntarily stopped production for anything except equipment failure or weather. "You're serious? Keep the plant on standby. I'll be back before dark." Parker loaded his truck with supplies, water, food, a first aid kit, basic tools, and drove east toward Hunker Creek. The journal mentioned landmarks: a distinctive rock formation shaped like a broken tooth, a bend in the creek where the water ran clear over a gravel bed, a stand of spruce trees that had survived the mining activity that stripped vegetation from most of the surrounding area. The roads deteriorated as he got farther from the main operations. Gravel gave way to frozen mud, then to tracks that were barely visible under accumulated snow. Parker navigated by the journal descriptions, comparing what John had written in 1946 to the landscape in front of him. 3 hours of searching brought him to a section of Hunker Creek that matched. The rock formation was there, weathered but recognizable. The bend in the creek was there, ice-covered now but following the contour John had described. And in the spruce stand, set back from the water, was a structure. The cabin was smaller than Parker had expected, maybe 12 by 14 feet, built from logs that had grayed and cracked over decades of exposure. The roof sagged in the middle, and one wall had started to bow outward, but the basic structure remained intact. The door hung from a single rusted hinge, open a few inches. Parker approached carefully, testing the ground and the door frame before stepping inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the gray daylight filtering through a small window and the gaps in the roof. A cast-iron wood stove sat in one corner, its pipe collapsed. A wooden bunk was built into the opposite wall, the frame still solid, but the rope supports long rotted away. Shelves made from rough planks lined another wall. A table with one chair occupied the center of the space. Everything was covered in dust and debris, leaves that had blown in through the open door, animal droppings, fragments of the ceiling that had fallen over the years. But underneath the decay, the essentials were recognizable. This was where John Schnabel had lived through the winter of 1946, alone in 12 by 14 feet of space, heating cans of food on that stove, sleeping on that bunk, sitting at that table, writing letters by candlelight while the temperature outside dropped to 50 below zero and the darkness lasted 20 hours a day. Parker stood in the center of the room trying to see his grandfather at 24. A man who'd survived a war, lost the woman he loved, and driven north until he couldn't drive anymore. A man who'd spent 7 months teaching himself how to survive grief through physical labor and isolation. That he walked to the shelves along the wall. Most were empty, whatever they had held long since taken or rotted away. But on the lowest shelf, pushed into the corner where it had escaped notice, was a tin cup. Rusted but intact, and scratched into the side the same way the box had been marked, J.S. Parker picked it up. It was lighter than he expected, the metal thin from age. His grandfather had drunk from this cup. He had held it in the same hand that later taught Parker how to operate an excavator, how to read pay dirt, how to push through exhaustion when there was still gold in the ground. That he sat in the chair, John's chair, and looked out the small window at Hunker Creek, at the mountains rising beyond. The view hadn't changed in 78 years. The same water, the same ridgelines, the same brutal landscape that had either broken men or made them. The grandfather Parker knew had been hard, demanding in ways that sometimes felt cruel. Every success was met with, "Good, now do better." Every failure was analyzed, criticized, filed away as evidence of weakness that needed correcting. Parker had spent years wondering why approval never came easily. Why John couldn't just say he was proud without attaching conditions. Sitting in that cabin, holding that cup, the pattern made sense. John had learned something in this room that he'd spent the rest of his life trying to teach, that survival required everything you had. That comfort was a luxury you earned through work. That weakness, emotional, physical, any kind, could kill you in country like this. Every impossible standard, every harsh word, every time John pushed Parker past what felt like his limit, John wasn't withholding approval. He was trying to give his grandson the tools to survive the kind of breaking John had barely survived himself. Parker sat there until the lights started to fail, the tin cup still in his hands, walking away from the gold. When he got back to Dominion Creek, Brennan was waiting by the workshop. "You find what you were looking for?" Parker nodded. "So what now?" "We've got maybe 48 hours of weather left, if that. Still 800 ounces short of target." Parker looked at the operation spread out before him. The wash plant. The excavator. The cut where they'd found the box. The ground that still held gold, the richest pay layer they'd found all season, just sitting there waiting to be worked. They could push through, run double shifts, maybe close the gap before the cold forced them out. His crew would do it if he asked. "They'd done it before." "Button it up," Parker said. "We're done for the season." Brennan stared at him. "You're serious? You're walking away from 800 ounces. That's $1.5 million sitting in the ground. It'll still be there in April. And if someone else files on this section over the winter, if the claim boundaries shift, then they get it. But I don't think that's going to happen. And even if it does," Parker pulled the tin cup from his jacket and set it on the workbench next to the metal box and the letters he'd found. "Some things matter more than the gold." Brennan was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll get the crew started on winterization. We can have everything buttoned up in 2 days if we push." The next 48 hours were spent securing the site, draining hydraulic lines so they wouldn't crack when temperatures dropped further, winterizing engines with the right fluids and covers, pulling the wash plant's pumps and storing them where they wouldn't freeze, covering exposed equipment with tarps weighted down against the wind. It was the same process Parker had done at the end of every season. But it felt different this time. He kept stopping to look at the cut where they'd found the box. Kept thinking about John at 24, burying his grief in frozen ground and walking away. On the last morning, before the crew drove out in convoy, Parker walked to the edge of the cut alone. The excavator sat silent, its bucket resting on frozen gravel. The wash plant was covered and dormant. No diesel engines running. No rattling sluice boxes. No crew members shouting over the noise. He thought about the letters still in the workshop, the story they told. He thought about John's choice to leave the Yukon in 1946, to trust that his healing was real enough to survive contact with the world. He thought about the risks John had taken afterward, loving again, building a family, creating something that could be lost the same way Eleanor had been lost. Parker didn't know yet what he'd do with what he'd found, whether to share it publicly, let people see this hidden chapter of his family's history, or keep it private, just another story that stayed within the Schnabel family. That decision could wait until spring, until he had time to sit with it. What mattered was simpler. He had a tin cup that belonged to his grandfather. He had answers to questions he hadn't known to ask. And when the weather broke and the ground thawed, he'd be back. The gold would still be waiting. He took one last look at the silent operation, then turned and walked to his truck. The cup was in his jacket pocket. The metal box was secured in the cab behind the seat. Parker started the engine and pulled out of Dominion Creek, leaving the excavator alone in the frozen quiet, its bucket still resting on the ground that had given up the only thing his grandfather ever tried to bury.